Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Surya Prakash Upadhyay from IIT Mandi. Today we are going to talk on module Urban Commons, Ecologies and Environmentalisms from the paper Sociology of Urban Transformations. So students, let us see what we are going to learn in this module. In this module, we will critically examine the city-nature dichotomy, provide an overview of the major conceptual frameworks that have been applied to understand linkages between the city and the environment. We will also trace the antecedents of the ideas underlying international paradigms such as the urban political ecology. Towards the end, we will try to understand the political ecology of contestations over the urban environment in Indian cities. So, what do we talk about when we talk about the city? Is it the sum total of the built-up space and made-made infrastructures? Or what role, if any, do natural processes and the non-human world play in shaping the urban environment? In fact, in what sense can we speak of an urban environment? Cities and the country or nature have often been seen as polar opposites. This contrast even underlies Ebenezer Howard's reconciliation of city and country in the Garden City program. Yet, in recent time, scholars have turned away from this dichotomous framing of city and nature in favor of one that recognizes nature in the city. So in this module, we consider how sociologists and other social scientists have theorized and understood the relationship between human and natural forces in the urban. To start our overview of relevant paradigms, we begin with Roseland's enumeration of scholarly and practice-oriented attempts to connect the city and nature as habitats and systems. Some of these are programs for action and praxis and have met with varying degrees of success and longevity. Urban ecology, social ecology, bioregionalism, and sustainable developments are some important paradigmatic themes through which city-nature connections have been understood. Gaston takes a very broader view of the term urban ecology, and he traces it to the recognition that the planet's ecosystems are now dominated by humans and more particularly by urban agglomerations. Gaston's urban ecology distinguishes two distinct conceptions of urban ecology. One, the ecology in urban areas, that is, ecological forces in urban areas. And two, ecology of urban areas, which views the city as a whole ecosystem into itself. In this module, our focus remains on social science scholarships, which has evolved tremendously in the 2 decades. Starting with an introduction to the notion of urban metabolism, which derives from the disciplines of industrial ecology and ecological economics, we turn to the social science paradigms of urban political ecology, bourgeoisie environmentalism, and the emerging literature on the urban commons in India. It is worth noting here two broad intellectual antecedents of the literature on these themes. One of these strands builds upon the Marxian prescient insight that antithesis between nature and history is created only when the relationship of man to nature is excluded from history. A second strand follows from the work of Elinor Ostrom and her co-authors on the urban commons. Though originally applied to common property resources such as fisheries, timber and non-timber products and water, the notion of the commons has been fruitfully harnessed to examine urban ecosystems in Indian cities. Starting with urban metabolism, we discuss various related ideas to understand urban environment. Urban metabolism. Urban metabolism is one of the foundational concepts in recent research on human-nature interactions, and one that has been variously adopted and translated in the social science frameworks. Brotto et al. Defined urban metabolism as the exchange processes whereby cities transform raw materials, energy, and water into built environment, human biomass, and waste. Despite its origin in the disciplines of industrial ecology and ecological economics, it is not surprising that a term has come to center of debates around sustainable development. Enriched by a multi literature, the concept has proved successful in incorporating understandings of how socio-economic arrangements mediate the flows of resources and outputs through the city. Brutto et al. Outlines 6 major thematic clusters within the interdisciplinary conversation around urban metabolism. 1. The city as an ecosystem. 2. Material and energy flows within the city. 3. Economic material relations within the city. 4. Economic drivers of rural-urban relationships. 5. The reproduction of urban inequality. And 6. Attempts at re-signifying the city through new visions of socio-ecological relationships. These analyses, as exemplified by the work of Martinez Elias and others, foreground inequalities produced through urban metabolic processes and place them at the root of resource conflict. The term metabolism, in fact, goes back to Marx, who described it as the material exchanges and interdependent relationship between human society and nature occurring through the labor processes. Marx saw urbanization as a cause of metabolic rift, which means the estrangement of the humans from the natural conditions of their existence under capitalism. This strand of literature has been particularly attentive to the transformations produced by neoliberal reforms. The urban political ecology literature, which sometimes deploys concepts of social and urban metabolism, lies in one of these clusters. Studies in this strand have made incisive contributions to the politics of urban water supply in particular, showing how infrastructure networks reflect socio-economic inequalities both in the global south and global north. More broadly, urban political ecology framings of urban metabolism recognize infrastructure networks lying at the interface between nature and society as a key to metabolic circulation. The next section has much more to say on the urban political economy body of work, but suffice to note here that its key observation is that metabolisms have the potential to express people's drives, desires, and imaginations. Let us see what is the urban political ecology. In setting up the scholarly and practice gaps that impelled the formulation of the urban political ecology framework, Heinen et al. Underscored two in particular. One was a challenge of renaturing urban theory, which since the late 19th century had become thoroughly denatured, that is, inattentive to the intersections of urban and natural worlds. Second, there was an equal neglect of cities in environmental theory and praxis, which tended to focus instead on problems on the global scale, such as deforestation or global warming. Responding to these ruptures, Heinen et al. Defined the agenda of urban political ecology thus: to the extent the cities are produced through socio-ecological processes, attention has to be paid to the political processes through which particular socio-environmental urban conditions are made and remade. The urban political ecology aims to conceptualize the urban as an arena not only of the built and social form, but also of biological and physical processes. At the heart of this scholarly turn in the idea of the social production of nature, first set out by Smith, which posits that natural and ecological conditions and processes do not operate separately from social processes, and that the actually existing socio-natural conditions are always the result of integrate transformations of pre-existing configurations that are themselves inherently natural and social. The urban political ecology perspective allows then interesting answer to our questions about what is urban about an environment. Hennen et al. Argue that the environment of the city, both social and physical, is a result of a historical geographical process of urbanization of nature. Together, these propositions imply that the social production of nature is not a neutral enterprise, but one that creates winners and losers by favoring certain groups and classes over others. This is one of the main contributions of the urban political ecology framework. Authors such as Macfarlane suggest that a metabolic lens proves useful because it allows an expansion in political sites of intervention, from water pipes, drains, and power stations to laws, policies, and officials, widening the object of analysis and the epistemology of social change. Following on the previous discussion of urban metabolism, it is useful to understand how urban political ecology scholars have bent the concept to their purpose. In this literature, modes of regulation and consumption are central to analysis of metabolism. Urban political ecology expands the conceptual territory of metabolism, include dimensions of political changes, the critique of capitalism, social factors, and the agency of nature. A proliferation of thematically varied studies in field sites in the global north and south helped ground these ideas. Scholars have empirically as well as theoretically analyzed aspects of water and air, wooded areas, parks and lawns, land use, urban environmental politics, and food. Although very few in number, studies in Indian cities illustrate how an urban political ecology framework enriches our understanding of nature in the city and the ways it is constituted through social relations. In a comparative study of Toolville in California's Central Valley and Bomanahalli outside of Bangalore, Ranganathan and Balas highlights the disparate ways in which water access, state practice, and political agency are negotiated in the broader geography of water marginalization in fringe urban spaces. Their analytical approach combines urban political ecology with environmental justice scholarship. For example, they highlight how agency in struggles to access water is read through a rights-based framework in the US, but through the lens of claim-making in India. While rights have legal backing, claims lack legally enforceable support. Against this backdrop, Jimmer's account of urban parks in Gujarat's Navsari agglomeration raises important concerns about who directs and controls the location and uses of nature in the city, and how such ownership comes to be shaped by partnerships between public and private actors. In Jimmer's telling, the construction and sustenance of the park system in the towns has been a project of middle-class ambition from its very origin in the displacement and relocation of slum population to urban peripheries in order to constitute a particular elite urban aesthetic at the heart of the city. Issues of sponsorship, management, and governance of urban nature has been further exacerbated in two of the parks being run under a private-public partnership model. Veron deploys the urban political ecology paradigm to analyze the environmental governance of air quality in Delhi. Veron says that even though air quality is not traded on the market, it does command a premium on real estate markets. This is the context under which the matter of who pays for clean air becomes relevant. Veron contends that the environmental non-governmental organizations and judiciary that have shaped Delhi's air pollution policies show a distinct bias for middle-class environmental interest. Although incredibly disparate, both Jimmer and Veron's work, even while resting on the urban political ecology foundation, shows undeniable parallels with the preoccupations flagged by Bhaviskar's conceptualization of bourgeoisie environmentalism in Indian city. So we discussed about urban political ecology, and now we turn to one of the major themes called as bourgeoisie environmentalism, and see how this idea unfolds. So Maudsley explores the relationship between middle classes and the environment and asks why this group was such a central actor in environmental debates. Middle classes were exerted considerable say in these discussions, first through their power as consumers and second through their sway in the media, politics, scientific establishments, NGOs, bureaucracy, environmental institutions, and the legal systems. Moreover, Maudsley argued that an emerging environmental consciousness had become evident in the middle class engagement with matters ranging from pollution to green spaces to waste management. Exploring the discourses surrounding on the rise of environmental activism among the middle classes, Maudsley contrasted such involvement to traditional high caste disregard for civic cleanliness and public spaces, more generally among the middle class groups. Key to this dynamic was the tendency of the middle class actors to contribute environmental damage to population growth and thereby growing number of the poor. These trends underpinned Amitabh Bhavishkar's influential coinage of bourgeoisie environmentalism, which means an increasing propensity for urban space to be organized around urban class dispositions on aesthetics, leisure, safety, and health. Bhavishkar's formulation owed its genesis to an incident in 1990s Delhi, when the conflict over the use of public space literally and tragically turned fatal when Dilip, a young man from a jhuggi, was clubbed to death by police and residents in the middle-class locality of Ashok Vihar because they suspected him of using the neighborhood park for defecation. Thus, in Dilip's killing, two understandings of neighborhood park came face to face. One, the middle-class residents' view of it as an oasis of trees and nature, and two, the jhuggi dwellers' desperate resort to it as an open-air toilet. Deploying this analytical frame, Bhavishkar argued that the state making in Delhi includes interventions aimed at improving the environmental quality of life for Delhi's bourgeoisie and at the expense of non-elite groups. Geithner took Bhavishkar's argument further in his dissection of the legal and popular discourses around Delhi government's Clean Delhi, Green Delhi campaign. According to him, elite groups in Delhi tied deficiencies in environmental well-being and appearance to the presence of slums, largely through the legal category of nuisance. Some of the contradictions inherited in this framing became apparent in Geithner's opening account of the legal battles over the privately deployed Vasant Kunj Mall to be built on the South Delhi Ridge, which according to the Delhi Master Plan was a protected green space. Elsewhere also, like Aurobindo demonstrated the ways in which rainwater harvesting, first proposed as a low-impact and indigenous solution to the chronic water shortage in Chennai, became another environmental movement for bourgeoisie environmentalism. This study also undermines the paradoxes inherent in bourgeoisie environmentalism. Other authors such as Maudsley et al., Macfarlane, and Fallman have examined how bourgeoisie environmentalism manifests itself in settings as diverse as visitors to protected areas to the making of Delhi's Yamuna river front. As we have seen, the notion of bourgeoisie environmentalism shares in common several surmises with the urban political ecology framing. However, whereas political ecology is more formally an analytical approach, bourgeoisie environmentalism describes a pronounced and enduring dynamic in the way social actors conceive of and act upon the urban environment. So let us see some of the theoretical renderings on urban commons. and how it has been understood in Indian context also. As an antidote to bourgeoisie environmentalism's fetishism of nature, a scholarship on the city-nature relationships in Indian cities have turned its attention to the commons. This introductory section of this module has laid out Austin's pioneering elucidation of governance issues surrounding the commons. Though the commons as a conceptual framework had been applied hitherto largely in rural settings, but in recent times it has been elaborated on the meanings and practices associated with the commons in urban India. Gidwani and Bhavishkar offer a wide-ranging definition of urban commons as, and they consider it as public good also. So for them, the air we breathe, public parks and spaces, public transport, public sanitation systems, public schools, public waterways, and also the less obvious municipal garbage that provides livelihoods to waste pickers, wetlands, water bodies, and riverbeds that sustain fishing communities, washerwomen and urban cultivators, streets as arteries of movement, but also as places where people work, live, love, dream, voice, dissent, and local bazaars that are sites of commerce and cultural invention. So in contrast to the idea of the public, which lies firmly within the ambit of the state and law, Vinay Gidwani and Amita Bhavishkar emphasize that the commons lie at the frontiers or within the intersects of the territorial grid of the law. The commons, both ecological and civic commons, stand opposed to commodity in scholarly discourse. Unlike an idealized nature, the ecological commons do not exist a priori but are produced through practices of commoning, that is, through communities of people willing to create, maintain, and protect them. Some of the papers that recently came out in Economic and Political Weekly take up these themes. An important case study of history and contestations surrounding the urban commons comes from the work of Amita Bhavishkar in the issue. Speaking to the material and symbolic presence of Yamuna River in Delhi, Bhavishkar limns that the commingled natural culture meanings of river inscribes and delineates the trajectory of riverbank as an urban commons. In a pattern characteristics of the enclosure of the commons, bastis such as Yamuna Pushto were torn down. A conflict between world-class visions and ecological rhythms underpins the significance of the Yamuna riverbed as an urban commons. Political and real estate players have emphasized world-class riverfront projects to domesticate the Yamuna on par with the Thames in London and Seine in Paris. Yet, the viability of such a project to convert the riverfront into a public space remains doomed. First, by the scale of displacement entail, and second, by sponsorship and development by the corporate interests to cater to the private and elite public modes of consumption, such as high-rises, gated and price attractions. The diverse uses and ecological dynamics of water bodies have rendered a notable area of study for scholars interested in the urban commons. A scholarly debate has engaged with two important themes. One, a widespread narrative that blames urbanization for the loss of the commons. And second, the transformation in uses that accompany processes of enclosure of the commons through assignment to either public or private property. Regarding the first dimension of the debate, the effects of urbanization are especially potent in peri-urban areas, which have witnessed a real estate boom in post-liberalization era. Narayan and Viz report evidence from three fast-growing urban centers, Gurgaon, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. For example, in the rural peripheries of Gurgaon, acquisition of private agricultural as well as commons land deprived Dalit cattle herders of grazing lands and increased women workload in fodder collection. In both Hyderabad and Bangalore, urban growth and real estate development has struck the death knell for intricate system of lake and water bodies, once again disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable. In a close inquiry into the transformations surrounding the system of over 3,000 man-made water bodies dotting the Hyderabad Metropolitan Development Authority area, Anand Maringanti interrogates this received wisdom about the hazards posed by untamed urbanization to the commons. Under a regime of ambiguous land records and informally ascribed customary land rights, these bodies in Hyderabad have been laid open to creeping encroachment and occupancy processes over decades, leading in time to commodification and land use conversion. That is, a process of enclosing the commons. Thus, Maringanti argues that a right to the city, first envisaged by Lefebvre in the capitalist urban space of North America and Western Europe, and exercised in Indian context through subaltern claims on urban space, often appears to stand in opposition to the right of urban commons. Maringanti's argument requires an unpacking of the idea of commons to recognize that Hyderabad's water bodies have been produced over long periods of time through the informal accretion of usage and appropriation rights that go beyond formal ownership with public or private actors. Against this backdrop, rescuing the water bodies as commons calls for the assembly of new communities based on critical knowledge production. In a case study in Bangalore, Sudarshan shows how the unmaking and the making of Rajpalaya Lake as an urban commons occurred at the interface between the making and unmaking of communities and their political networks. Once again, this account of commoning contrasts with the work of D'Souza and Nagendra on Bangalore's Agara Lake, which reiterates that the ways in which processes of urbanization comprise the commons. However, the authors also highlight how the change in governance from village community to the government has served to transform usage patterns and shift perceptions of the lake to an arena of pristine nature. Parthasarthi explores the livelihoods of hunters, gatherers and foragers that subsist on the vestiges of the urban commons remaining in Mumbai metropolis. The water bodies and the sea, increasingly susceptible to real estate pressures, support a variety of fisher folks, including the coolies. Although publicly owned, areas such as the Sanjay Gandhi National Park as well as the salt pans continue to perform some of the livelihood functions of resource commons, supporting primary sector activities such as salt panning and hunting, gathering and foraging. Garrett Haddon's famous tale of the tragedy of the commons casts a long shadow on the international literature on the urban commons. Haddon's thesis asserts that any open access resource would be vulnerable to overexploitation because of the difficulty of excluding potential users who lack the incentive to use the resource sustainably. It is only recently that scholars have begun to theorize if and how this tragedy plays out in the urban context. The empirically rich Indian literature on the urban commons represents a major advance in this relatively new body of work. Supporting the observation that both aggressive nationalization and privatization of the urban commons have failed, it provides valuable nuance and critical inventory based on the modes and effectiveness of collective action in the urban sphere. In this, Indian studies on the urban commons make a significant contribution to Harvey's call to find creative ways to use the powers of the collective labor for the common good. So students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. This module has attempted to provide an overview of the social science approaches to understanding the actors, discourses and mechanisms that mediate and explicate the relationship between the urban and the environment. And this survey is far from comprehensive. For example, we have not considered Maudslay's reworking of the idea of environmentality in the context of Delhi's Bhagidari scheme. It also does not do justice to recent studies by authors such as Marin Helen Gira and Frederick Lande on the urban protected area interface in places like Mumbai's Sanjay Gandhi National Park, or to a rich literature on waste as resource. It also bypasses the burgeoning policy literature on sustainable development and does not critically engage with emerging notions of resilience. This module has tried to establish that far from being a value neutral and marginal dimension of the urban, natural processes and resource flows are central to constituting politics and power relations in the city. If, as Brotho et al. State in their survey of urban political ecology inspired studies of urban water distribution networks, cities have different parallel metabolisms for the same resource. The choice of metabolic channels also coincides with shifting power relations. Policy biases such as neoliberal reforms can then lead to fragmented resource economics. In different ways, the three major paradigms discussed here, urban political economy, bourgeoisie environmentalism, and urban commons, all indicate productive directions and an ample evidentiary foundation for policy and collective action. So in this manner, the welding together of empirical scholarship with praxis is a major dimension of scholarship on the city and its ecologies. Thank you.